Hello everyone, Alec Elger the SideQuest Gamer here, and I just hit 200 subscribers. Thank you so much. I can't thank you enough, guys. And in the spirit of that, I will be reviewing another video game platform. Last time when I hit 100 subscribers, I did my Game Boy Advance review. Well, this time, in the spirit of 200 subscribers, I'm doing a console review, the Nintendo 64. It was a big part of my childhood, but let's examine it. Okay, it may not be the greatest console of all time, nor the greatest Nintendo console, but for those who think it's either of those, I will likely become really good friends with because the Nintendo 64 had an amazing library of games and impressive hardware for its time. The Nintendo 64 is a 5th generation console developed by Nintendo IRD and manufactured by Nintendo and Foxconn. It was released in 1996, 1 year after its main competitor, the Sony PlayStation. The Nintendo 64 managed to sell 32 million units worldwide during its retail availability from 1996 to 2003, with most of its popularity being in North America. While this may seem impressive, it's not as good as the NES's 52 million units or the Super Nintendo's 43 million units. It didn't even win the console war in sales because the PlayStation, which sold 102 million units worldwide, likely because all the kids who wanted to play the next Mega Man, Final Fantasy, and 2D Castlevania found it on the PlayStation instead of a Nintendo console. There was also the Sega Saturn in the 5th generation console wars, but despite being the most advanced console of its time, it was extremely hard to develop for as a result, causing its library of games to be lacking, mostly consisting of first-party releases from Sega. And with no main series Sonic game other than a compilation game, it failed miserably to compete with the Nintendo 64 and the PlayStation. So the Nintendo 64, by the end of the 5th generation of gaming, managed to place second in the console wars, losing only to the PlayStation. But it's not like the kids who chose the Nintendo 64 over the PlayStation, it's not like they didn't have a good console themselves. They had a great console. The console did have superior graphics to the PlayStation with its SGI Reality coprocessor. The console also had a 64-bit NEC VR4300 CPU, which was impressive for its time. However, one of the major criticisms of the game console that I strongly agree with is the decision to stick with cartridge-based media instead of compact disc technology, when clearly that was an inevitable transition in gaming. That was such a poor decision on Nintendo's part, because the problem with cartridges is that they are hard to develop for due to their limitations like audio and memory storage. I mean, compare Echo the Dolphin Genesis version to its Sega CD counterpart, you'll see a major difference in quality since the CD version sounds nicer and they could do more with the extra memory that the CD technology allowed for, while the cartridge version is still good in its own right, but not as good as the CD version. And a much better example would go for the multi-platform release Gex 2, Enter the Gecko. Gex 2 was amazing on the PlayStation since it had audio clips including voice acting, but the Nintendo 64, while it had more vibrant colors in the graphics, it was inferior since it didn't have the FMV, and correct me on this if I'm mistaken, but the draw distance on the Nintendo 64 version seems to be not as long as the PS1 counterpart. They're both great versions to have, don't get me wrong, but the PS1 is the superior version by far, in my opinion, because the FMV and superior audio just gives the game more life, since it did have a story that, while it didn't take itself seriously, was pretty well written despite the pop culture references dating the game even back then. Now, as for notable games on the Nintendo 64, there are so many, but a lot of the great franchises we loved on the NES and Super Nintendo like Mega Man, Castlevania, and Final Fantasy had pretty much moved on to the more successful CD-based system. And while Mega Man Legends was ported to the Nintendo 64 and Castlevania got 2 3D games on the 64, they weren't the games we loved on the NES and SNES, especially Castlevania 64. And no, that's not a nostalgia argument. I said that in terms of gameplay. Mega Man Legends, while fun, takes a lot to get into and it really didn't feel like a Mega Man game. Heck, Mighty Number 9 is more of a Mega Man game than Legends, but it is a decent game as its own thing, but it still didn't feel like a Mega Man game. And I really can't say the same for Castlevania 64. That game proved to me that some franchises are just best left in 2D. Mario, Legend of Zelda, and Sonic got lucky that their first attempts were great. Not perfect by any means, but a great start in the third dimension. While I'd love to talk more about the transition to 3D for all franchises, I have to move on. The 64 wanted everything to be in 3D. And the games in its library that weren't Castlevania or Paperboy did that perfectly. Super Mario 64 is the best-selling game for the system, with 11 million copies being sold, and even introduced us to the collectathon concept, which was used because back then a game could only generate a limited number of 3D worlds. So in order to compensate for that, developers gave the players so many things to do in that one space rather than have a point A to point B concept. Although Crash Bandicoot on the PS1 did that perfectly on the PS1, where you go from point A to point B in over 32 levels, it's still just 32 levels compared to Super Mario World's 90 plus levels. But back to Mario 64. It was awesome and was practically my childhood, but best game ever? Well, even as a kid, I wouldn't say that exactly, but if someone did say it was the best game ever, I would definitely understand. One of my childhood favorites was the massive Donkey Kong 64, which, looking back on it, perhaps was too big. It was fine when I was 9 years old with all the time in the world, but I'm 20 years old right now with less patience than I used to, and getting 100 golden bananas as the bare minimum to beat the game is too daunting of a task now. Not as good as I remember, unfortunately, but last year when playing Banjo-Kazooie for the first time in my life, I can say that game is one of the best games on the system. No nostalgic connection whatsoever, well, other than the Nintendo 64-esque art style. Now, if you are on the internet for so long and to hear about all the fanboys saying that Nintendo's not as good since Rare left to join Microsoft, you've probably heard of a game called Diddy Kong Racing. And Diddy Kong Racing and Mario Kart 64 were great racing games for the console, but I will say this. I never played Mario Kart 64 as a kid, while I did play Diddy Kong Racing to death as a kid. Comparing the two, Diddy Kong Racing had the better adventure, while Mario Kart 64 had the better multiplayer. Sorry, but battle mode on Mario Kart 64 was done much better than in Diddy Kong Racing. GoldenEye, which is another favorite from Rare fanboys, was awesome as a kid, but I will say that it didn't age that well. But if you can get past the graphics and the clumsy enemy AI, you might be in for a good time. Zelda Ocarina of Time, if you're a Zelda fan, you've probably heard a lot of. You also probably heard a lot of Majora's Mask, and those two games were fantastic adventure games on the 64, and Ocarina of Time was a great transition into 3D. I mean, I know some will disagree with me on that, but you gotta admit, it was pretty impressive. However, while Ocarina of Time is my favorite Nintendo 64 game, I can't exactly say it's the best Zelda game ever. One of my all-time favorites is Star Fox 64, which is a fantastic space shooter in 3D. The Star Fox 64 was the first to use the Rumble Pack add-on for the controller, which made it vibrate when certain things happened in a game, but I never used the Rumble Pack. But it is kind of a cool introduction to the vibration feature, which was a standard for controllers in the 6th and 7th generation of video games. Super Smash Bros. I never had as a kid, but playing it last year, it was a lot of fun, and definitely one of the best defining games for the system. So, the console had a rich library of games. While not as many as the PS1, I will say quality over quantity, but both libraries are tied for me in terms of quality. My main gripe with the console is that the games like Donkey Kong 64 and Zelda Majora's Mask needed the memory expansion pack in order to work. Even though DK64 came with the memory expansion pack, Majora's Mask didn't, which made buying the games used kind of a challenge. I mean, I'm pretty sure Nintendo didn't think of that, but still. Also, the controller is poorly designed. There's 3 handles, and it's just and the buttons are all over the place. The joystick was fine and all, but the D-pad and the left shoulder button I almost never used, except for Kirby 64. So overall, I think the Nintendo 64 is a great console. I mean, sure, it's not as good as a PlayStation, and it does have a few flaws with it, but I think every collector should seek this one out. I mean, it has an amazing library of games, and there's just like something very charming about it. It's only $50 to $60, and I don't think you'll lose any sleep over buying one for yourself. If that's not much of a convincing argument for you, here is one reason, and probably the only reason for you to buy it. Super Smash Brothers. I mean, sure, you could download that on the Wii Virtual Console or Wii U, if it's even on the Wii U Virtual Console. Anyways, thank you so much for 200 subscribers, and guys, remember to stay awesome, my friends.